God, owning our error, accepting our fate. I'm Michael Dowd, and I'm recording this in October of 2021. The other subtitle could be Ecotheology 101. An ecological and deep time historical, that is an eco-theo, and I'll explain that here in a few minutes. An eco-theo worldview is vital for understanding how and why nothing can slow, stop, or reverse what necessarily follows ecological overshoot. Unsustainable civilizations can never become sustainable as they're collapsing. In fact, they can't become sustainable. They've never become sustainable ever. We have over 100 examples. Technology and the market hasten and expand collapse and multiply extinctions. Science and religion have unknowingly conspired to create a literal hell on earth. The near-term extinction of Homo colossus, that is industrial civilization, is a certainty, and that may or may not include Homo sapiens. It is inevitable that most people will deny the above, and how and why that's okay. And it's still possible to avoid worst-case scenario and to live and love fully, even at Teotihuacan, that is the end of the world as we know it. So that's what this program is going to be covering. Thomas Berry, one of my great mentors, has two quotes. I'll show this one and another one very similar. We're talking only to ourselves. We're not talking to the rivers. We're not listening to the wind and the climate. Most of the disasters that are happening now are a consequence of that spiritual deficit. My way of saying it is that we are committing ecocide because believers and atheists alike fail to relate to primary reality as primary. By not honoring and respecting the biosphere as our living and undeniably real biophysical creator, sustainer, and end, anthropocentric or human-centered civilizations inevitably self-destruct. So here's the outline of what I'll be covering in this presentation. God, owning our error, accepting our fate. And notice I have the earth emoji. I'm meaning by God, reality with a personality. I'll say more about that, a lot more about that. So our living, nested, biophysical creator, sustainer, and end. That's what I'm meaning by the word God. God's time, that is reality's time, the cosmic century timeline, and untrivializing idolatry. It's not bowing down to statues. God's nature and religion's purpose, the four laws of true sustainability, problems versus predicaments, 6 ecocidal delusions, and what's really urgent, and then what is inevitable and what's unstoppable, and then also what's futile, and then what now? Living meaningfully and courageously in the end times. And make no mistake, we are in the end times, not just mythically speaking. So let's take a look at God, our living, nested biophysical creator, sustainer, and end. This is a fundamental principle of life, of true sustainability. Relate to the larger body of life as divine or perish. Or a more indigenous way of saying this would be relate to the community of life as kin or perish. It's sometimes called a kin-centric worldview rather than a human-centered worldview. John Michael Greer is one of my favorite authors. He says, the first law of life is limits. So we need to demythologize faith. Your God is whatever you put your faith or trust in. It's your ultimate concern. And this isn't just Michael Dowd saying this, arguably the most influential theologian of the 20th century, Paul Tillich, famously identified faith as your ultimate concern. Ludwig Wittgenstein was one of the most famous philosophers of the 20th century, philosopher of language. He says, the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. And nowhere is that more true than our name or names for our biophysical creator, sustainer, and end. This reality, which is not about beliefs, it's inescapably real. And what we know is that reality is nested. And how we name it is an existential issue. That is, it's a life or death issue. I like these Russian nesting dolls, subatomic particles within atoms, molecules, cells, organisms, and all the way up and all the way down. Of course, we're in the middle somewhere. We're made up of smaller, creative, intelligent realities like our microbiome, and we're part of larger, creative, intelligent realities that we utterly depend upon. And so it's obviously more complex than this. But primary reality, by primary reality, I mean everything inside us and everything outside us that we don't exist without. It's primary. We're derivative. We're dependent. Martin Buber, the famous Jewish theologian, said, if we don't have an I-thou relationship, that is a respectful, honorable, personal relationship to reality, we'll cause our own extinction. And that's what we've been doing. We've been basically treating the living world, the universe, as a complex clock. And God is the clockmaker outside the universe. And if you believe in the clockmaker, you're a theist. And if you disbelieve in the clockmaker, you're an atheist. And both sides treat the biosphere as an it, not a thou. And all indigenous cultures had what I call an eco-theo worldview. That is, the ecos was related to as divine, and the theos, the world of spirit, was infused, embodied within the living world. Gaia would be good enough, except if you have a concept of God that is your ultimate authority that's outside Gaia, and then it's not enough. So that's why I've begun spelling God, G, Earth emoji, D, because that's what I'm meaning. Any notion of God that doesn't include the living, pulsing presence of the biosphere is an ecocidal notion of the divine. And a number of Catholic nuns and neo-pagans and others have begun spelling God the Old English way, G-O-D-D-E. It's gender neutral, but also what we're meaning is reality with a personality, not a person outside reality. So that's what I'm using. God, either with the Earth emoji or G-O-D-D-E. In other words, it sounds the same, but visually it quickly catches you. What we're meaning is reality with a personality, not a person outside reality. Now, of course, when I speak in college and university settings, I can usually count on some philosophy major to say, well, what do you mean by reality? And I love Philip K. Dick's definition. Reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. And whatever else can be said, time is real, whether we believe in it or not, and nature is real, whether we believe in it or not. So from this perspective, what's a God's eye view of the world? Well, it's not the view from outside and above it all, like the clockmaker. No, this is a God's eye view of the world. It's the subjective experience within every creature. This has got to be included in a God's eye view of the world, the subjective experience of every creature. Thomas Berry said it this way: the universe is a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects. The environment, after all, is not our surroundings. It's our biophysical and living creator, sustainer, and end. Daniel Wildcat, a Native American elder and teacher, says, we live among relatives, not resources. See, that's that kin-centric worldview. And this is similar to the one I quoted before, but it's a little different. Our fundamental problem is that we no longer listen to what the earth, its landscape and climate, its mountains and valleys, and all the flora and fauna of the planet are telling us. And I think the reason is because we haven't understood or appreciated one of the most important scientific discoveries about religion and about our brains in the last several hundred years, which is that our brains personify. That is, we give human characteristics to what's more than human, what's other than human. Wendell Berry said it well. He said, nature is party to all our deals and decisions, and she has more votes, a longer memory, and a sterner sense of justice than we do. James Hillman, one of the most famous psychologists of the last 50 years, really understood. In fact, he said, you can't understand the world's myths and religions if you don't understand our brain's propensity to give human characteristics to what's more than human. He said, loving is a way of knowing, and for love to know, it must personify. Personifying is thus the heart's mode of knowing. It's not a lesser, primitive way of apprehending, but a finer one. To enter myth, we must personify, and to personify carries us into myth. And by myth, he's not meaning an untrue story. He's using it the way Joseph Campbell did, a narrative that puts us in accord with the nature of reality. Hollywood and Conservation International teamed up a few years ago now, and there's about 15 of these little 1 or 2 minute nature speaking videos. I've often shown the one with Julia Roberts speaking as Mother Nature, not about Mother Nature. And of course, whatever we mean by the word God has got to include all these voices, the voice of reality in all of its nested forms. For example, climate. There's not a culture in the history of the planet that didn't personify the climate as divine blessing or divine judgment. And it's not a surprise. I mean, can you think of any force in the universe that more consistently creates cultures and brings them into existence, sustains them and destroys them than climate? Here's just an example: Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. These make no sense in Hinduism if you think of them as otherworldly entities. But this is a personification of the creative force of the universe, the sustaining force of the universe, and the destructive force of the universe. Sustainable means faithful, and unsustainable means unfaithful. This is one of the most important things I'm going to say in this whole program. Faithful to who, or faithful to what? Well, faithful to time and nature, faithful to the ancestors, faithful to the descendants, that's the whole seventh generation, and faithful to Gaia, faithful to the body of life, faithful to God, that is faithful to reality. And unsustainable means unfaithful. Because nature, as we've just seen, is nested. But time is also nested. The past isn't behind us, it's not to our left. The past is within us, the DNA, the atoms of our bodies. The present and everything we do ripples out into the future. Time also is nested. So I suggest there are two fundamental ways to relate to reality, or to relate to God. Time and nature. By God, that's what I'm meaning. Again, primary reality. We can relate in a faithful way, that is a pro-future, honorable way, or an unfaithful way, anti-future, ecocidal way. And to relate faithfully is to be humble. It's a sane worldview, life-centered rather than human-centered, and it has limits, sacred limits. Limits are sacred if anything is. To relate in an unfaithful, anti-future, ecocidal way is to have hubris rather than humility. I love the ancient Greek definition of hubris, the overweening pride of the doomed. I got that from John Michael Greer. It's human-centered rather than life-centered, and it's exploitative. It's a sense of limitlessness, which is ecocidal. That's why I speak of ecology as the heart of theology. In fact, here's my credo, my creed, my faith statement in a nutshell. This is sacred realism or religious naturalism credo. Reality is my God. Evidence is my scripture. The epic of evolution is my creation story. Ecology is my theology. Integrity is my spiritual path. And promoting fidelity to reality is my mission. So we looked at our living, nested, biophysical creator, sustainer, and end. Let's now take a look at God's time, reality's time, the cosmic century timeline, and untrivializing idolatry. And I encourage you actually to take a break. I'm sharing a lot right now, right? So take a break, stretch, and then come back to this. So let's now take a look at God's time, reality's time, cosmic century timeline, and untrivializing idolatry. Evidence is the main way reality is revealing itself to us. Evidence should be considered modern-day scripture. It's our main source of trustworthy guidance, scientific evidence, historic evidence, and cross-cultural evidence. Because anytime any religious tradition or any scripture says God said this or God did that, what follows is always an interpretive personification. And so it's our anthropocentric, our human-centered hubris, and our inability to read mythic literature that has made us blind and deaf to what God or reality has been revealing for centuries through evidence. So here's one example, the cosmic century timeline. We compress the whole history of the universe into 100 years, just to make it easier to grasp. The Big Bang, or the Great Radiance, 13.82 billion years ago. Here's the time scale. Every decade is 1.4 billion years. Each year is 140 million years. Each hour is 17,000 years. Each second on the cosmic century timeline is roughly 5 years. So at that time scale, these are the familiar landmarks. These are the familiar things. I do a whole program like this. Biological evolution here. And what I want to focus here is just on the last 4.5, 5 years, the last just little bit in Earth's history. That is the last 550 million years in terms of temperature. And on the left is degrees Celsius, and on the right is degrees Fahrenheit. So this is a logarithmic chart. It's very easy to read it wrong. That's why I've got this here. But it works really well because this is the 1960 to 1990 baseline temperature average. And these are the 17 glacial periods. It's driven 17 times. The glaciers have come south And the glaciers have gone back in the last 2.5 million years, driven largely by the Milankovitch cycles. That is, the Earth wobbles like a top. And Homo habilis, walking upright using stone tools, back here about 2.5 million years ago. Homo sapiens here about 300,000, 400,000 years ago at the most. Notice the stability and the CO2 range, the carbon dioxide range, atmospheric range required for both agriculture and complex civilizations. It's between 280 and 350, or some would say 380 parts per million. This is evidential revelation. Now, notice here, Homo colossus, that is industrial humanity, doesn't survive beyond about 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial. And Homo sapiens doesn't survive above 4 degrees Celsius. And yet here are the projections in 20 to 30 years, and then in 60 to 80 years. This does not bode well for our kind of mammalian primate life. And notice here, this is again evidential revelation, the CO2 levels of the last 800,000 years. Here we are now at 415 parts per million in 2021. And notice the peak glacials. We've got 180 parts per million at the peak. That's how low it gets for, when the ice was maximum thick and maximum south. The ice age is roughly 200 parts per million. Pre-industrial, that is before the Industrial Revolution, before 1750, the average was about 280 parts per million. Agricultural collapse and civilizational collapse really become unavoidable beyond 350 or 380 parts per million. Now, climate change, we talk about an abrupt, runaway, irreversible. It's not just climate change. We're into an abrupt climate change regime. Because, for example, right now in 2021, the CO2 equivalent, that is when you add carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide together, we're over 500 parts per million already. So what is all of human history in this time frame? Well, it turns out the last week on 100, if the whole history of the universe is 100 years, that is, if the beginning of the universe is 1 second after midnight on January 1st of the year 0, and right this moment is December 31st, right at midnight, about to go into the 100th year, at that time scale, humans have been around for the last week. And climate change, Milankovitch cycles, asteroids and supervolcanoes, plate tectonics, which is, of course, the main thing that causes volcanoes and tsunamis. All of this has been going on and will continue to go on long after we're gone. And I suggest that ecotheo is a good way to describe that as being faithful to the past, faithful to the future, and faithful to the body of life, faithful to God. And it's only been the last 40 minutes on this time scale that we've been in a profoundly unsustainable way. Totalitarian agriculture, that's a term from Daniel Quinn. We see boom and bust, rise and fall civilizations. And we see anthropocentric or human-centered religions. This is a time of being unfaithful to the past, unfaithful to the future, and unfaithful to nature. And if we survive this bottleneck, which we may not, it'll be going back to, I call it the prodigal species, a return to ecotheo. The more likely scenario is actually near-term human extinction. And you hear sometimes people say, well, you don't expect us to go back to the Stone Age, do you? Well, if you want an accurate or fairly accurate depiction of Stone Age living, watch Kevin Costner's film, Dances with Wolves. That's a pretty accurate description of Stone Age living. It's not caves. There will be a next year. There will be 140 million years from now. Our kind won't be here. But one of the things that gives me hope, genuinely, is that on this time scale, this cosmic century, God's time, on this time scale, our worst case human damage, like if all the nuclear power plants melt down by early March on this time scale of the 100th year, Earth will have recovered. That gives me hope. We're not going to see worst case, I don't think. Let's quickly look at the last hour, the last 17,000 years. So this is from 11 p.m. till midnight on December 31st of the 99th year. Ecotheo, or what I sometimes call permaculture 1.0, Tending the Wild. There's a very famous book, Tending the Wild by M. Cat Anderson, Native American Knowledge and the Management of California's Natural Resources. This has happened all over the world, as Julia Watson talks about in Low Tech. TEK is traditional ecological knowledge, designed by radical indigenism. And then Robin Wall Kimmerer's New York Times bestselling book, Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants. These represent profound, life-centered, ecocentric wisdom in working with the living world. So that was going on for most of human history until about 11:20 p.m., which is where we see totalitarian agriculture. That is, now it's all human-centered. We don't care about any other species. It's all about us. Chiefdoms and Kingdoms at 11:30 p.m., just 7,500 years ago. The Parable of the Tribes is a book that was written by Andy Schmuckler. A fabulous book, because he shows that really with the mining of metals and a domination mindset, you enter an arms race that it was eventually going to arrive right where we are. And a fabulous introduction. This is just a 1-hour audio, which has excerpts and 2 reviews of Parable of the Tribes. You get a great overview of the entire book if you just listen to this audio. City-states and writing, just 5,000 years ago. Empires, just a little bit after that. The Axial Age, the era of beliefs, where it's all about solo escape from the world. And we know of over 100 boom and bust civilizations, rise and fall, progress, regress, between 11:35 p.m. and basically now. Clockwork universe. We've only had this trivial understanding of God. God is a clockmaker outside of a clockwork universe for the last 500 years, the last 2 minutes on this time scale. And then industrial overshoot, the 6th mass extinction, and the carbon pulse. What I mean by the carbon pulse, here's a good image. If you go back 8,000 years, or you go forward 8,000 years, muscle and firewood were the primary sources of energy. And if we survive, that will be the case into the future. And M. King Hubbard, the guy who came up with Hubbard curve and predicted peak oil and all that, this was the expectation from the 1950s into the early 1980s, that nuclear power would be our way to the future. Well, fortunately, this book, the most important book by far that I've ever read in my life, in fact, Derek Jensen and Paul Ehrlich and many of us consider this the most important book of the 20th century, by William Catton, Overshoot, the Ecological Basis of Revolutionary Change, was the nail in the coffin of that vision of nuclear power, because all nuclear power would do is exacerbate overshoot. And make sure you read the foreword by Stuart Udall, the former Interior Secretary under the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. Even though this was written in 1980, his foreword is still one of the most scathing attacks or critiques of techno-utopian thinking. Because here's the thing, when we overshoot planetary boundaries, even if we could solve the climate crisis, which we can't, there are more than 6 other planetary boundaries that we're already in overshoot of that would do us in. And so I consider the last 35 to 40 minutes the age of idolatry. Again, not bowing down to statues or believing in the wrong God. It's human-centeredness. It's anthropocentrism rather than ecocentrism or life-centeredness or kin-centric worldview. Again, idolatry, what I mean is human-centeredness. It's anthropocentrism. It's having an unreal notion of God, a divinity that's not synonymous with reality. It's failing to honor primary reality, the biosphere, as primary. We are derivative. It's taking primary reality, the soil, the forest, the water, the climate, taking that for granted. It's having an ultimate authority that leads us to betray and condemn the future. And there are secular and religious forms of idolatry. In a religious world, I think idolatry of the written word, idolatry of the otherworldly, and idolatry of beliefs are the 3 most prominent forms of anthropocentrism. Idolatry of the written word is where we think God's best guidance, that is our best map of reality, is frozen in time in some ancient text. Idolatry of the otherworldly is where we think where reality resides, or ultimate reality resides, is only outside time and nature. And idolatry of beliefs is where we privilege beliefs over knowledge. But there are secular forms of idolatry. Idolatry of progress, growth, development. If progress or growth or development is your ultimate concern, that's your God. It's an idol. Idolatry of human intelligence and agency, the idea that we can do anything just because we can think it. And man, conqueror of nature through technology, probably the most ecocidal thought form in human history. Joseph Brodsky was a Soviet, or not Soviet, but Russian polymath, literature professor. He won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1987, and he taught at some of the most prestigious universities and colleges in North America. And he famously said, "You Americans are so naive. You think evil is going to come into your houses wearing big black boots. It doesn't happen like that. Look at the language. It begins in the language." A widely held belief that virtually guarantees short-term hope, long-term fear, and eventual crushing disappointment, and dozens of nuclear catastrophes, is what I call the ecocidal hubris of the almighty we, a secular religious faith in omnipotent human agency, so-called progress and development, collective choice and control, biosphere management, climate restoration, another way of saying geoengineering, species level awakening, or the evolution of consciousness. All of these are examples of the ecocidal hubris of the almighty we, faith in the omnipotence of human agency. Abrupt, runaway, irreversible, out of our control, not just climate change, but climate mayhem. 50 years, 33 conferences, and half a dozen major international agreements have not reduced atmospheric carbon concentrations at all. In fact, here's another one. Our summits, agreements, promises, and pledges are worse than meaningless. And the reason they're worse than meaningless is because they keep us from doing the things we need to do to avoid being evil on a geological time scale. I'll say more about that in a few minutes. But notice here, all of our agreements, and it's rising exponentially. This is the thing. During the 1960s, carbon dioxide rose at about 0.9, just under 1 part per million per year. And then in the 1970s, it rose 1.3 parts per million per year. In the 1980s and 90s, 1.5 parts per million per year. In the 2000s, 2 parts per million per year. And now in the 2010s, 2.4, and 2020 was 2.5. This is rising. So you could make the case that what's causing this, obviously this is tongue in cheek, are our agreements. Our agreements are actually causing this ridiculous. Now, obviously they're not, but they're not doing anything to slow, stop, and cannot reverse it. So again, I encourage you to take a break, stop, get up, maybe pour yourself a stiff one or get a cup of coffee and then come back. Let's take a look at God's nature, religion's purpose, the 4 laws of true sustainability, genuine sustainability. And again, what I mean by God's nature is reality, the nature of reality. So remember, this evil begins in the language. Well, what do we call this? That which brought everything into being, that which nourishes and sustains everything, and that which receives everything at its end. It doesn't matter whether we believe in this or not. This is inescapably real. But what do we call it? What's our name? Well, what we call reality, what we call nature, what we call the environment, indigenous, that is faithful, sustainable, pro-future cultures, experienced personally and honored in an I-thou, respectful way. A human being has no existence outside the environment, that is God or Gaia. There are none of these in existence, isolated human farmers. There are only these, farmers in habitat. This is the reality. We don't exist outside the living world. So I want to speak just briefly about the evolutionary and ecological purpose of religion and the religious necessity of science. And 2 of the leading scientists of the world have been at the forefront of this, David Sloan Wilson and Edward O. Wilson. Now, they're not related, at least not closely, but they're both written dozens of books. Or actually, David hasn't written dozens, but Ed has written 12.5. And he's probably the most famous scientist alive. And they've both done a lot to further this notion of the evolutionary and ecological purpose of religion and what I'm calling the religious necessity of science. David Sloan Wilson has this incredible distinction, a really important distinction between practical truth or practical knowledge, practical realism, and factual truth or factual knowledge, factual realism. Practical truth is if you act and your society acts as if it's true, you'll experience personal wholeness, social coherence, and ecological integrity. Doesn't need to be factually true, but factual truth is what science specializes in. But if factual truth isn't interpreted in ways that help the society live in right relationship to reality, then it can cause its own extinction. And it turns out that practical truth, which is what religion has really been all about at its best, will outcompete factual truth every day. Anthropocentric notions of the supernatural lead to ecocide. Now, there are also life-centered, ecocentric, or kin-centric notions of supernatural. Those don't necessarily lead to ecocide, but human-centered notions do. And this compelling paper by Benson Saylor in 1977, Supernatural as a Western Category. And then this book, which really established an entire field of evolutionary religious studies, Faces in the Clouds, A New Theory of Religion by Stuart Guthrie in 1993. And this is a textbook by Winkleman and Baker, Supernatural as Natural, a biocultural approach to religion. Because once you have the notion of the natural as not divine, well, then this notion of the supernatural leads you to degrade. In other words, the notion of the supernatural does two things. A, it trivializes God. God's no longer revealed in and through nature, an expression of nature and time, but it also desacralizes the living world. So one of my intellectual mentors is Teddy Goldsmith, Edward Goldsmith. He was the founder and the editor of the Ecologist magazine for some 40 years. And he speaks also about the vital role, the necessary role of religion in stable, sustainable cultures. This is a good quote. It may not be irrelevant to note that even very modest forms of life, like earthworms, dung beetles, and fiddler crabs, have no trouble identifying the real problems that they must deal with if they are to survive. Teddy Goldsmith wrote a number of books. This one here, The Stable Society, wrote in the 1970s. What he means is he took a look at the best anthropological evidence of over 500 years on what's the difference between genuinely sustainable cultures and unsustainable civilizations. And then his magnum opus is The Way, an ecological worldview. And he identifies, he actually defines religion as the control mechanism of sustainable or stable cultures. What he means by mechanism is simply that aspect of society that speaks with moral authority that the future will not be compromised by the present. If religion doesn't do that, if life ways don't do that, no other aspect of society will do that. But religion in unsustainable civilizations really becomes merely a coping mechanism. It helps people adapt and have good lives and die peacefully and leave a sweet legacy in the midst of unsustainable, ultimately ecocidal civilizations. And this is from the table of contents in The Way. In traditional, that is stable or sustainable or pro-future societies, technology is in accord with the needs of the biosphere. Settlements are in accord with the needs of the biosphere. The economy, education, community, basically everything is in accord with the needs of the biosphere. And of course, this makes total sense when you realize the biosphere is primary reality and we're derivative. We can't mine and exploit the rest of the living world and have it not ultimately impact us. Turns out that religion needs science and evidence needs a moral voice, which can't happen. It won't happen when the biosphere is exploited as it rather than honored as thou. So again, this is his definition of religion as the control mechanism of stable, sustainable societies. Here are three things that he identifies as present in all truly sustainable cultures. The idea that all benefits and all real wealth come from the living biosphere, what I'm calling God with the earth emoji. God or reality will continue to dispense these benefits and wealth only if life's critical order, that is its essential integrity or way, is honored and preserved. Therefore, the fundamental role of religion or life ways is to ensure that the culture or society remains faithful to reality, faithful to time, faithful to nature. How? By fiercely preserving the integrity of the ecosphere and what he calls the critical order of the cosmos, or the way. And there were four main ways that this happened: God first, seventh generation, sacred limits, and consequence capture. Now, this is my way of language again, not Teddy Goldsmith. But the reason I have exclamation points is because these were enforced on pain of death or ostracizing. I call these the 4 laws of genuine or true sustainability. God first, 7th generation, sacred limits, and consequence capture. God first is an ecocentric or life-centered, not anthropocentric, not human-centered measures of wealth and well-being. It's measuring wealth and well-being in terms of how well is the soil doing decade by decade? How well are the forests doing decade by decade? How are the other species doing decade by decade? Anthropocentric measures of wealth and well-being are how well individuals or corporations or empires or kings are doing. This is unsustainable. 7th generation, turns out that failing to prioritize the future over the present is evil. Sacred limits, grace limits, material grace limits are real and must be honored to avoid a living hell, to avoid ultimately ecocide. There's a limit to how much we can take and a limit to how much we can exude in terms of waste before the systems break down. It's known as carrying capacity in the ecological world. And consequence capture, impacts for good or ill must be mirrored back. Individuals, corporations, and nation states that do well to the larger common good should benefit. And the more good they do, the more they should benefit. And individuals, corporations, and nation states that disregard or harm the common good should be taxed or penalized, or there's moral strictures, so that it becomes in their self-interest to do the right, just, ecological thing. And it also becomes in their self-interest to not do the unjust, unecological thing. That's the way things are organized in truly sustainable tribal cultures. And that's not at all the way things are done in empires and nation states and the way in industrial society. So pro-future, pro-nature, God first, eco-theo, all of these I use synonymously. When religion succumbs to human-centeredness, that is idolatry, we inevitably confuse good and evil. Demonic economics is a predictable result. And I realize this is, religiously loaded language. What am I meaning by demonic economics? Well, here's an example. Yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. Here's another one. And so while the end of the world scenario will be rife with unimaginable horrors, we believe that the pre-end period will be filled with unprecedented opportunities for profit. I suggest that there's one major religious ecocidal delusion. I'll be talking about 6 secular delusions, but one major religious ecocidal delusion, which is the idea that God is either supernatural or that God doesn't exist. I suggest that the theism versus atheism debate is a form of collective insanity. You got thousands, maybe millions of people debating whether or not God is real or whether or not God exists, when the one real God, namely reality, personified or not, we've been living out of right relationship to, and we are now about to experience consequences of biblical proportion. It's crazy. And I go into great depth of all this in my hour and 10-minute program, Sustainability 101. Indigenuity is not optional. So again, I encourage you to stop, take a break, go get yourself a cup of coffee or whatever, or just, stretch and then come back, because this is a long program and really it's best to take it in pieces. Let's now take a look at problems versus predicaments. 6 ecocidal delusions and what's really urgent at this time. Problems versus predicaments. A problem is something that can be solved or potentially be solved. A predicament is something you have to live with, adapt to. It can't be solved. There are no solutions for predicaments. There are only outcomes. But we're used to thinking of things as problems. During the 20th century, if you threw enough money and energy at something, you could solve a lot of problems. Well, climate and overshoot are predicaments. In fact, in the first section of this book, Catton talks about, and again, if you only read one book the rest of your life, if you want to understand our situation, I encourage you to read Overshoot. I've also recorded the entire thing. It's all freely available up on SoundCloud. But the unfathomed predicament of humankind, what he means is it's not recognized and it's a predicament. We can't solve it. The discovery of the New World and the extraction of fossil fuels led Americans, and now all the nations of the world, to have carrying capacity surplus expectations and institutions. Yet our predicament is that we actually live in a carrying capacity deficit world. This is a predicament. So here are 6 secular ecocidal delusions. The first is that civilization is better or more evolved or an improvement over primitive. Remember the Brodsky quote about evil coming in the language? Well, here's a good example. What do we think of when we think of civilized or primitive? Well, I suggest that these quotes will call that into question. Forests precede civilizations and deserts follow them. All of our exalted technological progress, civilization for that matter, is comparable to an axe in the hand of a pathological criminal. Civilization is a hopeless race to discover remedies for the evils it produces. The end of the human race will eventually die of civilization. The earth is littered with the ruins of empires and civilizations that once believed they were eternal. These are heavyweight quotes. And this last one isn't an exaggeration. A couple of years ago, the BBC had a deep civilization series, an article by Luke Kemp called "Are We on the Road to Civilizational Collapse?" And he has this chart that shows 88 ancient civilizations just between 3000 BCE and 1000 of the Common Era. Just that 4,000-year period, there were 88 civilizations. He shows how long they lasted and what they died of and that sort of thing. And of course, if you go back before 3000 BCE, or if you look at the last 1,000 years, we're well over 100. And it turns out that collapse is a feature, not a bug. It's a feature of human-centered civilizations. It's not a feature of truly sustainable indigenous cultures, but it is a feature of human-centered or anthropocentric civilizations. And Arnold Toynbee, the famous historian of the 20th century, said, great civilizations are not murdered. They take their own lives. And we actually know how. We know a lot about how civilizations commit ecocide or suicide. And this is just the last 5% of human history, the last 8,000 years, the last 400 generations, roughly. There's over 80 examples of this. And this process typically takes between 225 and 325 years. And the process looks like this: progress, rise, boom, and then regress, fall, bust. And this is a process of overshooting carrying capacity. Overshoot isn't just the point where you tip over. That's the beginning of die-off, but it's the process. Once you're living in an unsustainable way, that is, once you're degrading the living world in any way, in a way that it can't heal itself, you are overshooting the carrying capacity. And this is an unstoppable process of collapse. There's never in the history of humanity ever been a civilization that's been able to become sustainable on the way down. Can't be done. It's built on a totally different foundation. But what are our inner expectations, our inner reality? Turns out if you're born and you die in times of progress or rise or boom, well, of course you expect that your kids and grandkids are going to have it better than you, or more wealthy or easier or whatever. And if you're born and die in times of fall, of decline, of regress, well, of course your kids and grandkids are going to have it more difficult than you. It's when you're born in times of expansion and it shifts in your lifetime, that's what we call suffering. And that's where all of us right now are. So ecological overshooting of carrying capacity. Tom Wessel's a fabulous book, Ecological Worldview, The Myth of Progress. He says carrying capacity can be defined as the maximum population size that an ecosystem can support without being degraded in some fashion. And then William Rees, Bill Rees, co-founder of the Ecological Footprint. Human societies as temporally and spatially far-flung as the Mesopotamians, Mayans, and Easter Islanders came to ruin mostly because they expanded beyond the capacity of their environments to sustain them. Here's the thing. If you don't get overshoot, you'll misinterpret or misdiagnose virtually everything important. I cannot emphasize that too highly. So these are some of my post-doom conversations. Connie and I had a fabulous, both of these are like primers on the ecological worldview. William Rees and Tom Wessels, as well as Carl North as an amazing system scientist, and Sid Smith. And then, of course, Paul Ehrlich, the granddaddy of ecological thinkers alive today. I know these are all old white guys, but it turns out that indigenous peoples didn't have to worry about overshoot because they lived more or less sustainably. So that's why you got old white guys that are addressing this. Humans are the pinnacle of evolution and the most advanced creatures on Earth. This is another ecocidal secular delusion. In 2004, National Geographic had a book came out called Are We Alone? Scientists Search for Life in Space. And then in 2009, National Geographic cover issue, Are We Alone? Searching for the Heavens for Another Earth. And then again in 2015, Are We Alone? And then, of course, Brian Cox, who met Frank Drake, Are We Alone in the Universe? And here's SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Life, also in on this. Are we alone in the universe? And here it really tells. Is our planet really the only one where technologically advanced life has developed? The spring 2019 SETI class is determined to bring society closer to answering this question. Now, here's the thing. Technologically advanced life? No. We don't get to claim technologically advanced life if all that technology is destroying our very foundation for living. No, that doesn't get to be called technologically advanced. That's called technologically stupid. So, no, humans aren't the pinnacle of evolution, nor are we the most advanced creatures on Earth. That's the thing. This notion, are we alone? No, we're surrounded by millions of forms of intelligence that are equally as intelligent or more intelligent than us in some really vital ways. Another ecocidal delusion. Humans can prosper and progress within an abruptly overheating climate, toxic collapsing biosphere, and mass extinction of our own making. These are two of the most significant ecological and evolutionary thinkers of the 20th century, William Catton and Thomas Berry. I've already quoted both of them, but this is powerful. Human society is inextricably part of a global biotic community. And in that community, human dominance has had and is having self-destructive consequences. Thomas Berry, along similar lines, the most difficult transition to make is from a human-centered to a life-centered norm of progress. If there's to be any true progress, the entire life community must progress. Any so-called progress of the human at the expense of the larger life community must ultimately lead to a diminishment of human life itself. This is obvious when we think about it. And it's also obvious when you remember the nested nature of reality and that we are derivative, we are dependent, we are not primary reality. And we need to treat primary reality as primary or we perish. So I did a program, a 23-minute, I call it my Pinker takedown video, what it's sane versus insane progress. Because how we define and measure progress determines our behavior and what kind of a world that we're leaving our grandchildren and other species. Banking on technofix or political solutions will lead to catastrophic nuclear meltdowns and incalculable needless extinctions. Problems caused by economic growth and development will not be solved by more of the same. Indeed, our predicament will worsen. And understanding ecology, energy, and history undermines expectations that human ingenuity, technology, or the market can save industrial civilization. Turns out that ingenuity, technology, and the market are what got us into this mess in the first place. What's the nature of the society that we live in? Well, for the first 95% of human history, we lived in more or less sustainable within nature's normal cycles and rhythms. It's what I call pro-future or ahistorical. Living according to the daily and seasonal ups and downs. There was no human-made calendars or clocks, and there was no sense of progress. Even technological development in terms of, technological change in terms of weapons changed over long periods of time, very slowly. But then just the last 5% of human history, we've lived in boom and bust, rise and fall. Exploitative cultures, often 1 to 3 centuries. We see expansion and growth, carrying capacity surplus, that is more than enough energy and resources for that situation. Slavery, we see colonization, and it's really anti-future. And a sense of progress, at least for the elites, obviously not for the slaves, is not a belief, but it's an obvious fact. But then you achieve overshoot, and then there's the age of consequences. And there's usually a faster fall than the rise. It's known as the Seneca curve. Carrying capacity deficit, not enough resources, not enough energy. We see a contraction of all things, including a contraction of our sense of in-group and out-group, and a post-exuberant age. The wealth gap widens, and unworkability and denial reigns supreme. Here's the Seneca effect. Ugo Bardi, dear colleague, wrote this book, The Seneca Effect, Understanding Systemic Collapse, Why Growth is Slow, but Collapse is Rapid. And he quotes Seneca, the path of increase is slow, but the road to ruin is swift. And another polymath, Peter Turchin, who wrote a number of books, Secular Cycles, which he co-authored, and here as a typical shape, his Ultra Society, How 10,000 Years of War Made Humans the Greatest Cooperators on Earth. And this is a large scale. 10,000 years shows these patterns, these cycles over and over and over again. This is not controversial. Sustainable means faithful. It means safeguarding the living world as primary. It's the first 95% of human history, 200,000 years, 10,000 generations at least. The essential stance of virtually all pro-future, that is ecocentric or kin-centric or life-centered or land-honoring, where there's the sense that we belong to the land, not the land belongs to us. The essential stance is that wealth and well-being is measured by the year-by-year, decade-by-decade health and vitality of the soil, the forest, the waters, the life, and everything the culture or society needs to survive and thrive. And a number of profoundly important indigenous authors, Daniel Wildcat in his book Red Alert, Stan Rushworth, who's been working with Dar Jamel and working on some stuff. These are profound books here, Going to Water and Diaspora's Children. And of course, I've already mentioned Robin Wall Kimmerer's New York Times bestselling book, Braiding Sweetgrass. But they're also profoundly important Western thinkers. Teddy Goldsmith, I mentioned The Stable Society and his magnum opus, The Way, an Ecological Worldview. And then one of my favorite authors, Richard Adrian Reese, Rick Reese, What is Sustainable, and his Wild, Free, and Happy. It's all freely available on his website. And I've recorded all the chapters in Wild, Free, and Happy. And these, if you Google sustainability, you're going to realize that the Wikipedia page and virtually everything else you're going to find is completely insane. They start with civilization, which is practically the definition of unsustainable. If you want to understand true sustainability, you got to read one of the indigenous authors or these two, Teddy Goldsmith or Rick Reese. And I've also recorded the entirety of Sustainable Society, and I've recorded a number of the overviews and syntheses of The Way. Unsustainable means unfaithful. It means exploitative. It's the last 5% of human history. We see the well-being of the elites and ruling class, what gets called wealth and progress, goes up, while the well-being of the bioregion and the habitat, that is carrying capacity, real wealth, goes down. And where they cross over is overshoot. I keep mentioning this book because it's so important. This is the ecocidal pattern of more than 80 human-centered, that is anthropocentric civilizations. And you only understand this if you understand energy, ecology, and history. That's what you're watching the results of basically 8 years of me studying energy, ecology, and history. I've spent more than 12,000 hours. I've read dozens of books. I've recorded 24 of them. And I'm trying to compress that knowledge into this program. Here's a visual. What I call grace limits, carrying capacity. There's a limit. There's a grace limit. There's a limit before we lose the grace of the living world. And an overshoot really means betraying the future and stealing from posterity. It's what traditional societies would call evil. So the next secular ecocidal delusion is that we can slow or reverse collapse via solutions such as net zero emissions, clean green energy, renewables, climate restoration, geoengineering, drawdown, and so forth. No, that's a delusion. Because here's the thing, and this is the most painful slide. These two slides are going to be the most painful slides in this whole program. No matter how massive and effective is nonviolent civil disobedience, no matter who or which party is voted out or elected into public office, No matter how many people change their habits, become vegan, stop flying, stop driving, or whatever, no matter how many so-called game-changing, artificial intelligence-driven high-tech solutions are tried, no matter how successful we are at instituting a Green New Deal or greening capitalism, no matter how aggressively we try to shift to renewables or net zero emissions, no matter how much evolution of consciousness occurs in the next decade or two, should we be graced to have that long, no matter how many accords, what is pledged or agreed to, what laws are enacted, and no matter how many of us engage in regenerative, restorative soil building practices, and I suggest we do that, but no matter all of that, we have already passed a dozen or more tipping points that is self-reinforcing, cascading. The following are already far into unstoppable, rapidly increasing, cascading, out of control, that is runaway mode, these tipping points. The loss of the world's ice in the Arctic, in Greenland, West Antarctica, actually, ultimately, East Antarctica too, the mountain glaciers. There's nothing we can do to stop that. There's nothing that we can do to reverse this or slow it down even. And these two books, The End of Ice, I tell people, if you only read one book on climate change, make it Dar Jamel's The End of Ice, Bearing Witness and Finding Meaning in the Path of Climate Disruption. It is a prophetic book. And then Peter Wadham's, one of the top scientists in the world, A Farewell to Ice, a report from the Arctic. Because when most of the Arctic ice is gone is when the serious global warming begins. And learn about phase change and latent heat. Methane belching from the permafrost, from just the whole northern part of the world, methane hydrates, methane clathrates, millions of oil and gas wells where methane is leaking, wetlands. This is now in unstoppable mode because the more methane's released, the hotter it gets, the more methane released, hotter it gets. It's in runaway mode already. There's nothing we can do to stop this. Ocean acidification, ocean deoxygenation, and at least 25 feet of abrupt, nonlinear sea level rise. This is already baked into the cake, as it were. This is already in runaway mode. We can't stop this. The great conflagration of the world's forests. Even if we somehow miraculously stopped all emissions, all human emissions tomorrow, CO2 and methane would continue to rise because the world's forests, most of the world's forests are going to burn in the next 20 or 30 years. The great conflagration. Virtually every year, there are going to be bigger forest fires, more intense forest fires in Siberia, in Canada, in the Pacific Northwest, in the West, California, in Australia, in the Amazon. We're already seeing this. This is already in runaway mode, leading to the loss of most animal and plant species on land and in lakes, rivers, and oceans. And then increasingly severe and increasingly deadly weather through storms, floods, droughts, hurricanes, hailstorms, and what have you. All of these are already in cascading, out of control, runaway mode. And I acknowledge, I mean, I'll say at the end of this program, I do several programs on how to help people emotionally deal with all this stuff, because this is excruciating. We all want to deny this. Industrial civilization has eternal life. This is an ecocidal delusion, so that there's no urgency to prevent geological scale evil by preventing nuclear meltdowns or helping forests walk. Now, what do I mean by helping forests walk? Well, my wife, Connie Barlow, is one of the world's experts in the field of assisted migration. And it turns out Robin Wall Kimmerer, and she actually got this from an indigenous elder, but she's been the one popularizing this notion of helping forests walk. It's the whole field of assisted migration. Because it turns out that the difference between hundreds or maybe even thousands of species of native plants and trees surviving this century, or at least potentially surviving, and those same hundreds or potentially thousands of species going extinct this century will entirely depend upon humans assisting them in migrating poleward, because plants don't have legs, they can't move. And it doesn't guarantee that they'll succeed, but at least it increases the odds that they could pass through this bottleneck. Because some of these species are millions of years, the lineages are millions of years old. This is holy work, even if we go extinct in the near term. And my wife is one of North America's top people. This book came out, a major publisher, W.W. Norton, came out in June of 2020. Zach St. George, award-winning journalist. The Journeys of Trees, a story about forests, people, and the future. And it features my wife, Connie, from the very first sentence throughout the book. This is another painful slide. There are 440 nuclear reactors worldwide, requiring us to assume that industrial civilization has eternal life, has everlasting life. Yet we are already 20 to 30 years into abrupt, runaway climate change. So here's the thing. Here's the not $64 million question, the 64 million year question. As industrial civilization continues to collapse faster and faster, how many Chernobyl or Fukushima-like or worse meltdowns due to wildfires, hurricanes, droughts, tsunamis, power grid failures, political instability, or terrorism do you think are possible, likely, or inevitable? Ensuring as few nuclear meltdowns as possible is holy work. Perhaps the most accurate projection of what's inevitable is this 1972 limits to growth study, because here's the main scenario. This is the standard run scenario. Here's where we are now in 2021, and notice things are going down. I mean, there's a few things that are still going up, but not much. Over the last 10 years or so, there have been a number of assessments of how accurate this is. Ugo Bardi wrote a book in 2011, The Limits to Growth Revisited. And then Tim Jackson and Robin Webster in 2016. And there have been several others, even in 2020, just last year. And all of these show that this is actually right on schedule. This is exactly what's happening. Another ecocidal delusion is that there's nothing we can do to avoid worst case scenarios. Well, we just looked at several things. To avoid becoming evil on a geological timescale, we must minimize the deadliest toxicity, nuclear, methane, chemicals, and so forth. We can actually cap some of the, maybe many of the oil and gas wells. So that's lessening the deadliest of toxicity. Assisting plants, especially trees, in migrating poleward. And investing time, energy, and resources in all things regenerative agriculture, regenerative everything. We can regenerate ecosystems and learn from and support indigenous wisdom and resistance. The most important resisting of the evil that's happening, that corporations and governments are doing to the living world, virtually all of the major resistance is happening is being led by indigenous communities. And Westerners and we industrial colonial settler types really do need to support indigenous wisdom and resistance. I did a 65-minute program called Unstoppable Collapse, How to Avoid the Worst. Here's the basic thesis. The stability of the biosphere has been in decline for centuries and in unstoppable out of control mode for decades. This great acceleration of Gaian collapse is an easily verifiable fact. The scientific evidence is overwhelming. Evidence is also compelling that the vast majority of people will deny this, especially those still benefiting from the existing order, those legitimately concerned about the consequences of collapse, and those who fear that accepting reality means giving up. And yeah, that paragraph means virtually all of us. The history of 80 plus previous boom and bust, that is progress, regress, rise and fall societies, reveals how and why industrial civilization is taking its own life. Paradoxically, acceptance may be the only thing that can help us to not make a bad situation catastrophically worse, as well as to help us live fearlessly and meaningfully, even at the end of the world as we know it. So again, I encourage you to pause here for a few minutes, at least stretch, and then come back and be refreshed. What is inevitable and what's unstoppable? And then also, what is futile? I suggest that the very first thing that's inevitable is denial. Denial is the largely unconscious habit of thought whereby we refuse to accept the reality of things that are bad or upsetting, or that challenge our worldview, our legacy, how we live, what is required of us, and or our feelings of self-worth or superiority. Denial is also the instinctual impulse to reject or discount information that calls into question our hopes, assumptions, or expectations about the future. Yes, we all have denial instincts. I do, you do, everybody we know and love does, so we can have compassion for ourselves and each other. And really, denial often gets a bad rap. Sometimes denial is actually just adaptive inattention. There's many people that aren't in denial of climate change. They understand it, but they also understand that it's pretty much out of our control at this point. In fact, it is. And so they want to pay attention to the things that help them, be present to their kids or their grandkids or their job. So it's adaptive inattention. Stephen Jenkinson, a famous death worker, he's got this great quote. He says, inattention, that is not paying attention to the world's ecological state, is well advised, because attention to it mitigates against your happiness, your contentment, your sense of well-being. Having a conscience now is a grief-soaked proposition. Whatever spiritual awakening may have meant in the past, if you awaken in our time, you awaken with a sob. A second inevitability is mistaking ultimate cause. Most people, or many people, will think that our main problem is climate change. And as Richard Heinberg says, our core ecological problem is not climate change. It is overshoot, of which global warming is but a symptom. Here's the thing that we activists often focus on: climate change, ocean acidification, topsoil desecration and loss. These are all heartbreaking. 6 mass extinction, critical resource depletion, chemical and nuclear wastes, the growing gulf between the rich and the poor, economic instability and insanity, political dysfunction, the shrinking of in-groups, the rise of totalitarianism and other isms. Yet all of these are not the problem. These are all symptoms of ecological overshoot, of carrying capacity, which is itself caused by how we define and measure wealth, well-being, success, and progress, whether we define or measure these in terms of life-centered or human-centered. Human-centered or anthropocentric measures are how well corporations or nations or kings or whatever are doing. And God-centered or life-centered, ecocentric measures are how well is the soil doing, the forests doing, the waters, the other life, and so forth. True wealth and true well-being. Here's a look at industrial civilization over the last 270 years. Collapse is a process. It's not an event. It's where a gradual downward trend goes into out of control decline, runaway, or unstoppable mode. And it's known as the Great Acceleration. If you just Google the Great Acceleration, you'll see all these charts. And it's usually meant from 1950, 7 decades ago, or some things 2 decades ago. And everything we depend upon, I'll say more about these, but everything, every system that humans depend upon is not just in decline, it's in precipitous freefall, out of control freefall. Again, this is insanity. If you Google Great Acceleration, you'll find all of these charts, and it shows socioeconomic trends, it shows everything going up, and Earth system trends, everything going up, and sort of you get the impression that, oh, this must mean better. Well, no. These are ecocidal trends on the left. And on the right are the measures of Earth system collapse or Gaian collapse. Here's another way it's often portrayed: measures of the Anthropocene from 1750 to 2000. I got this from New Scientist. And again, you can find this if you Google Great Acceleration. And it's often meant since 1950, things have gone into hockey stick, the way Michael Mann talks about it. And there's even a book by Robert Colville called The Great Acceleration, How the World is Getting Faster, Faster. And here's the way it's portrayed: socioeconomic and Earth system trends. And yet these are the causes of biosphere collapse. And this is our only life support system. So let's make this actually look like it really is, because these are ecocidal trends and this is Earth system collapse trends. So it turns out, if you switch it on its head, Gaia's stability has been declining for 1 or 2 centuries, and in runaway, unstoppable collapse for 2 to 7 decades. The climate, the Holocene, the stability that allowed for civilization and growing grain at scale, we're losing, we've lost. That's why a multi-breadbasket failure, where 2 or more of the 5 main grain growing regions of the world, if they fail in the same year, you're looking at 1 billion people dying. If 3 or more fail, you're looking at 3 or 4 billion people dying within 14 months. So we've lost this. The ice, I've talked about this before. We're going to lose all the ice in the world. The oceans, plankton, corals, fish, acidification, rise, and then deoxygenation, loss of oxygen. Soil, the amount of soil, the fertility of the soil, the moisture of the soil, permafrost. Turns out there was only one mass extinction where we lost the insects and the forests, and we're actually increasing carbon dioxide and methane faster than that. So this is really the great acceleration of biosphere collapse. That's the actual fact. That's why I have it looking like this. So inevitability number 3 is that there will be a collapse blindness. Most people do not understand collapse. Like this book was written in French in 2015, just came out in English last year, How Everything Can Collapse. It's a profoundly important book. It's an excellent book. I've actually recorded the entire thing, audio recorded it as well. But Joseph Tainer's famous book, written decades ago, The Collapse of Complex Society, where he shows over and over again how technology and complexity actually lead to collapse. You keep adding technology and complexity, and it reaches a point of diminishing returns where the technology, the added complexity in technology actually creates more problems and the civilization collapses. And then this book, Technofix, Why Technology Won't Save Us or the Environment, by Michael and Joyce Hausman. Turns out that human technology that doesn't integrate with life's technology, nature's technology, God's technology, G, Earth emoji, D, does more harm than good. It just does it over time. Technology in the context of ongoing economic growth does not promote sustainability, but hastens collapse. Most technological solutions to social and technology-created problems are counterproductive. And this book shows why new technologies tend to be uncritically accepted, who really controls the direction of change, and why technology expands and accelerates ecocide. Inevitability number 4 is that there will always be people, not just in denial, but people who are cheerleaders of what's called progress. It's never been better, right? The Rational Optimist by Matt Ridley. Abundance, the future is better than you think. New York Times bestseller by Peter Diamandis. Factfulness by Hans Rosling. 10 reasons why we're wrong about the world and why things are better than you think. And then, of course, Steven Pinker, the best known. Enlightenment Now, the case for reason, science, humanism, and progress. And Steven Pinker in this book has 75 charts that show, as he did in his earlier bestseller, The Better Angels of Our Nature, he shows all these different ways. Now, they're all human-centered. They're ways that at least the elite or the privileged, why things are getting better. But it turns out that technological progress and expansion and economic growth and development is what has caused this. And he's absolutely right. But what he doesn't show is that technological progress and expansion and economic growth and development are precisely what's led to the fact that it's never been worse for everything we depend upon, everything we need. Overdevelopment, overpopulation, overshoot. And again, whether you look at the soil, the forest, the water, other species, loss of soil organisms, nutrients, groundwater, glaciers, rapidly and significantly expanding deserts, deadly droughts, heat waves, hurricanes, flooding, ocean acidification and oceanic dead zones, plastic pollution, nuclear wastes, toxic air, water, soil, and then the catastrophic loss of most species. And they're rapidly getting worse. All of this. And of course, overshoot leading to climate. So really, we need to call this what it is. It's technological devastation and ecocide and economic growth and destruction. That's the fact. Yet these prophets of progress don't see this. Now, how is that possible? How is it that Steven Pinker and these other prophets of progress don't recognize this? Well, I suggest it's because Steven Pinker is blinded by his religion, as are the others. Now, what do I mean by that? Pinker is a famous atheist. What do I mean by blinded by his religion? Well, I love this quote from Nobel Prize winner Steven Weinberg. With or without religion, good people can behave well and bad people can do evil. But for good people to do evil, that takes religion. And what I'm talking about are not supernatural beliefs. I'm talking about the secular religion of perpetual progress. Here's the creation story of the secular religion of perpetual progress. You got the Stone Age, cavemen, savages, primitives, hunter-gatherers. Things really pick up with the agricultural revolution. Notice the positive term. Farming, cities, civilization. The Enlightenment, reason, science, humanism, progress. That's the subtitle of Pinker's book. The Industrial Revolution, again, notice the positive term, fossil fuels, technology, and then globalization, space travel. And I don't know of a single techno-optimist that doesn't have a Star Trek vision of the future. You know, Elon Musk wants to live on Mars. I call this the techno-idolatrous ecocidal myth of man, conqueror of nature, the most self-destructive thought form in human history. Good people are dangerous, and great people will engage in great evil when their God is not synonymous with reality. That is, their ultimate concern is not synonymous with reality, or when their map of reality is outdated by privileging ancient mythic texts over current evidential revelation. But good people are also dangerous and will engage in great evil when they hold the ecocidal and self-terminating belief that we are destiny's darlings, masters of the universe, conquerors of nature, God's chosen species, or the pinnacle of evolution. So we took a look at what's inevitable, what's certain, what we can say with 99% confidence is certain. What's futile? Well, we don't want to invest in what's futile. We don't want to go counter to what's inevitable or what's certain. So what's futile? Well, I suggest that hoping and praying for everlasting progress, or if we all just fill in the blank, is futile. But it's also futile to expect your loved ones to not hope or believe in one of these two delusions. The most common ways that people think about it, and we see this in previous collapsed civilizations, most people think that things are going to keep getting better, or if we all just, believe this way or act this way or vote this way. And so we can have compassion for our loved ones who are going to believe one of those things. It's also futile, I suggest, to assume that technology or the market can sustain what is unsustainable. It's also futile to have faith in the techno-ecocidal religion of everlasting growth on a finite planet. It's also futile to expect our mismatched instincts to not at least occasionally challenge us. For many years, Connie and I did programs on evolutionary psychology and evolutionary brain science, which is what that's all about. And then denying that impermanence, death, and extinction are real and necessary. For many years, we also did programs on what I call sacred science, or a meaningful evidential approach to impermanence, death, and extinction. It's also futile to expect the elite and the powerful to repent of human-centeredness or anthropocentrism prior to collapse. It's not going to happen. We're actually already in the process of collapse. We're decades into it. It's also futile to expect industrial civilization or global capitalism to run on so-called renewable energy. And this movie came out, it was panned by all the liberals. Josh Fox came out and attacked this. So many people did. And everybody that attacked this movie by Michael Moore and Jeff Gibbs failed to understand the fundamental message, which is we are in ecological overshoot. That's a fact. That's not a belief. And no energy and no technology is going to save us. And then these two books just came out this year. Bright Green Lies, The False Promises of Mainstream Environmentalism by Derek Jensen, Lierre Keith, and Max Wilbert. And this book by Alice Friedman, Life After Fossil Fuels, a reality check on alternative energy. And you could, that's an expensive textbook, but if you just go to energyskeptic.com, you can get most of that material there. These books are the nail in the coffin of that idea that technology and the market and green technology and Green New Deal is going to save us. No, not at all. Turns out that techno-optimism, I love this cartoon. How about if your generation spends less time studying how my generation destroyed the environment and more time figuring out a magical solution? Climate restoration, that is geoengineering, negative emissions technologies, nets, BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. If you want to know how insane these things really are, just Google carbon sucking unicorns. And you'll see that Kevin Anderson, one of the top scientists in the world, just devastatingly attacks these as total insanity. So techno-utopianism, techno-optimism becomes techno-utopianism, and it really becomes techno-idolatry. It's making your ultimate concern the idea that technology is going to save our ecocidal ways of living. No. And then finally, it's futile to expect your technophile or planmeister friends to not call you a doomer for giving up. And what I mean by planmeister are those that believe that if you just have the right plan, we can make it. And there's lots of these out there right now. But people who still believe their religion is still having the right plan, or technology or the market's going to do us, they're going to call you a doomer. And they're going to say that you've given up. Just love them. Just love them. Those of us who live in a post-doom place, that is an emotional place where we've gone through doom, and we're now in a place of inspired local action in a post-doom way, we haven't given up. We've stood up. Empathy follows inevitably, follows naturally on the heels of accepting what's inevitable. So let's bring this to a close here. So here's what we've looked at. Our living biophysical, nested biophysical creator, sustainer, and end. Reality's time, cosmic century timeline, and untrivializing idolatry. God's nature, that is reality's nature. We looked at religion's purpose, the evolutionary and ecological purpose of religion, and the religious necessity of science, as well as the 4 laws of genuine sustainability, true sustainability. The difference between problems and predicaments, which is absolutely essential to understand. 6 ecocidal delusions, and what's really urgent, which is in supporting indigenous resistance, preventing nuclear and other toxic chemical things, and assisting trees in migrating. Those are really urgent. What is inevitable and what's unstoppable, and also what's futile. And let's conclude with what now? Living meaningfully and courageously in the end times. And that's where we are. Again, not just speaking mythically, but we're in Teotihuacan, the end of the world as we know it, which doesn't necessarily mean the end of the world full stop, but it does mean the end of these sets of living arrangements. I love these quotes. Kate Marvel is a climate scientist. She said, "We need courage, not hope, to face climate change. Courage is the resolve to do well without the assurance of a happy ending. Do not lose heart. We were made for these times." And I just found this one last month, Chris Martinson. Plant a garden, meet your neighbors, practice generosity, learn new skills, control what you can, and leave the rest. These are the 2 programs I recommend most. These are both designed to be helpful, supportive, I would say pastoral, but this helps people deal with climate anxiety beyond hope and fear. Clarity, compassion, courageous love and action, just a short 23-minute video, and New Serenity Prayer, emotional support for climate anxiety and environmental dread. Most of us are familiar with the Serenity Prayer: God, life, reality. Grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. And a lot of people don't know this next part. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as the pathway to peace. This, of course, was penned by Reinhold Niebuhr, a Protestant theologian in the mid-20th century. Longer, if you want something longer, and I encourage these: Post-Gloom, Deeply Adapting to Reality. It's an hour-long program. And The Big Picture, Clarity, Compassion, and Love in Action. These are much longer programs if you want to go more deeply into. And again, these are supportive. This is not the bad news. I've covered enough of that already. This is sort of how to deal with that, how to adapt to it, and how to still live life fully and love the life you live, even in contracting, collapsing times. This is what my life has been about these last few years. Post-doom, I've had almost 80 conversations, post-doom conversations, literally the top people in the world who get the bad news, including the most scary stuff, who've done the grief work, done the heart work, and to come through to a place of local inspired action. Regenerative conversations exploring overshoot grief, grounding, and gratitude. They're all freely available on YouTube. They're all freely available on SoundCloud and several other places, the audios and videos. I want to conclude with a quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer, one of the great Native American elders and plant scientists. Her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, is one of the top books I've ever read. She records it in her own voice, and I encourage you to actually get the audiobook. Many chapters have brought me to tears. Action on behalf of life transforms. Because the relationship between self and the world is reciprocal, It's not a question of first getting enlightened or saved and then acting. As we work to heal the earth heals us. Thank you.
Did you do a good job, Don?
I think I did a goodly job.